I've worked with hundreds of men and women on thyroid and adrenal healing. And in this longer video, I'm going to share with you my own labs and some things that maybe I have missed and what I've learned. So, this longer series here is at the request of the practitioners who are attending my seminars and the roundtables that I do, so that I can review this in an overarching way, just kind of remind us of some of the most important points that I went through in these lecture series. So this isn't every tiny little last detail, but if there is something that I'm missing here that you did want to have a greater question about, please leave it in the comments below. And I'm going to take my time going through this one because this is going to be a long video. But you can, you can increase the speed while you're watching it, or you can skip ahead to something that's interesting to you. But I'm going to try to give you all the information that I think is going to be important for us all to have moving forward. So I'm also going to be sitting, which I don't normally do when I'm teaching, but this is a long one. So I'll be on my feet all weekend teaching this. So I'm going to be a little more low key in my energy on this one. So this is Mastering Thyroid and Adrenal Wellness, Cutting Edge Insights and Strategies, parts 1 and 2. There are many more, and eventually I will get them all recorded and get them all online. Now, this was originally created for the Gady Institute when I was teaching a course on that, and it is available for that. But I also do teach this across the country. So we're going to be looking at the scope of the thyroid health concerns, and then we're going to get into the anatomy of the thyroid hormones and go through a few interesting details and things that I've learned along the way that I think might be helpful to fold in. First, the scope. So the prevalence and impact of thyroid disease. More than 12% of the US population will develop a thyroid condition during their lifetime. And an estimated 20 million Americans have some form of thyroid disease. And the global prevalence of thyroid disease is significant. Up to 10% of the global population affected by thyroid dysfunction. And this includes both hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. But hypothyroidism affects women more than men. Up to 1 in 8 women will have thyroid issues in their lifetime. And that's why I'm putting this under the playlist of women's health. Does seem to have more of an impact on women, and I'll get into a little bit of some of my ideas as to why that might be the case. Now, particularly thyroid cancer rates have been rising over the last several decades, with an estimated 54,000 new cases in the United States in 2025. Now, this is important because there is a wildly popular medication that is being used across the country that does have a boxed warning that does say that thyroid tumors and thyroid cancer may be one of the risks of that, and that is these semaglutide medications. So look at the medications that you're taking and know that if you're on those, there are things that you should be doing and ways to protect yourself from potential harm. Now, I'm not going to make any claims, but I'll tell you what I would personally be doing if I were taking that. Well, I wouldn't take that medication, no offense to anybody who is, but if I would want to be taking as much as I could to protect my thyroid and my pancreas and my entire endocrine system, because our endocrine system is truly what I'm talking about here when I talk about the thyroid. As I said in the previous video, the thyroid's right in the middle of your endocrine system. And so just to fix or to focus on just one aspect of this whole system kind of puts you at risk of throwing things out of balance. You really want to be looking at the entire symphony orchestra, not just one small section of it. If you have a string section that's slightly flat and you only focus on bringing them into the key that we're supposed to be in, well, you run the risk of the rest of the orchestra still being flat. So you want to make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody is in the same tune, okay? So the scope of this concern, the current statistics on this say that there is also a lot of potential undiagnosed cases, and this is sourced from thyroid.org. And do you think it's more than 50% or less than 50%? And in their estimation, it's 60% of individuals with thyroid disease are unaware of their condition. And that's often due to subtle symptoms or misdiagnosis. Now, here's where, as a nutritionist, I want to bring nutrition first to this conversation, because when we're identifying the patient population with thyroid health challenges, this research on the hypothyroidism prevalence in the United States, a retrospective study combining National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey and claims data. This was for 10 years, they looked at this. They were saying that it's growing and growing and growing. And so what I'm looking at is what's changing in our foods over time that could be contributing to this. Well, when we dive deeper into this, and we really look at even a greater amount of research into this study, the retrospective study, it does say that in geographic regions with insufficient iodine, primary hypothyroidism is most often due to iodine deficiency. So this should always be a part of any conversation around thyroid health, is first examining, are you getting enough iodine? Are you intaking enough iodine? Do you live in a geographic region with insufficient iodine? And what is a geographic region that is insufficient? Well, that's going to be anything that is more than 50 to 60 miles away from the ocean. So as soon as we get further away from a coast, the iodine levels in the water, in the soil, in all the plant and vegetation drops drastically to the point where it's almost irrelevant. So be aware of the fact that you may be living in an area, and it's quite likely that you live in an area where you are not getting enough iodine due to your geography. I actually practice out of North Texas, and clearly we're more than 60 miles away from the coast. So I do have to be aware that if somebody is concerned about their thyroid, well, we're in a geographic region with insufficient iodine. And that is the primary reason that it's happening according to this study. So we should rule that out because it's essential not just for the thyroid, it's essential for so much in the body, especially our brain. I just cannot repeat that enough, how important iodine is to the brain. So be aware of where you live and how much that impacts your levels of iodine. I'm going to go into that a few more times as I go through this. But in the areas where there is iodine sufficiency in the region, then it's autoimmune thyroid disease that is the most common cause of primary hypothyroidism. Now, what we need to start looking at in those cases are what are the things that are driving that? What are the things that are aggravating that are creating these antibodies? And is it wise to start employing things like these smart tissue support products like Thytrophin PMG to be able to bring in some protection? Now, I would say if I had any concern about my thyroid, I would have that smart tissue support in there anyway, just because we just need all the protection we can for our organs, cells, and tissues. And the more we can do, the better off we're going to be. And then second or central, hypothyroidism is less common and generally stems from a dysfunctional pituitary gland or hypothalamus. Now, this is really important to pay attention to. This is, again, that orchestra that we're talking about. If the thyroid is in the middle of that orchestra, we have the pituitary signaling to the thyroid what to do. And I think of that, the pituitary as the first violin, the concert master. For everybody takes their lead from following them. But conducting that that concert master is the conductor, the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is taking in all the information and really trying to bring everybody to the exact same place in the music together. So it stands to reason that we have a lot of things that are going to be not quite perfectly in harmony in the body if the hypothalamus is not feeling 100% and if the pituitary is not. So we have two very big opportunities for everything downstream from that to be not quite right. So we really should think upstream. And again, we've got these wonderful options for the standard process practitioners out there watching this to help to encourage support to our hypothalamus in that smart tissue support product, that protomorphogen, PMG. So you have it for the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And there are other things that you can do to support both of those, but just know that that's a good starting point that I would think about for those. Okay, so moving on. Let's see. Exogenous hypothyroidism is commonly a side effect of just medications. And at the very end of this, I'm going to go over a lot of the medications in the preview video to this whole lecture. I did talk a little bit about those, but also pay attention to things like surgery, radiotherapy, any kind of trauma to the head and neck region could be giving a little bit of challenge to the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the thyroid. So many things that could have happened over the course of your life that have made it so that they're just not operating at 100%. So there's also a symposium on geographical and geological influences on nutrition, iodine deficiency in industrialized countries. So there's a lot more attention going towards understanding this piece of where you live and how much that impacts your overall health when it comes to nutrition. And in geographic regions with insufficient iodine, again, that primary hypothyroidism is most often due to the iodine deficiency. And iodine deficiency is not only a problem in developing regions, it's also affecting industrialized countries. So globally, just to put this in perspective, 2 billion individuals have an insufficient iodine intake. And approximately 50% of the continental Europe remains mildly iodine deficient. Iodine intakes in other industrialized countries, including the United States and Australia, have fallen in recent years. So we really need to be paying attention. Are you part of that 2 billion people that you're just not taking in enough iodine? And beyond that, it's important to know, just getting enough iodine in doesn't ensure adequate iodine utilization and function in the body. We have these other chemicals that are very similar to those that we have high exposures to that can wash them out, that can deplete. Even if we're taking in enough, we're just not getting enough because we're being too exposed to things like chlorine, fluorine, and bromine, which is in a lot of baked bread, and people don't really realize that. So just pay attention to that. Be very cautious of the water that you're drinking. As I was teaching this week, I wanted to make sure that we were giving everybody bottled water that was from a spring instead of chlorinated or fluorinated water that is common in tap water. Now, it's wonderful that we have running water and we have access to this, and it's amazing that we live in the world we live in today, but we have to be mindful of the excess exposure that we're getting from the chemicals that are being put in that water. All right, moving on as we go to the next slide here. There is even the livestock and poultry environmental learning community that talks about this. They're very much aware that there are areas around the world where iodine is known to be low. So if you're in one of these red states, that might be something to think about even more. But I thought about this because when I grew up in Wisconsin, and this is what's called the goiter belt. And you'll see this, the darker this is, that means that there's naturally low levels of iodine in the drinking water. And what's interesting to note when you look at this is even on the coast over here, it's still known to have low iodine deficiency. So just living next to a coast doesn't necessarily guarantee that you have plenty of iodine. You still have to be aware of whether or not you are getting enough. Now, this is Christine Mason, one of my absolute heroes, one of the farmers at the Standard Process Farms. She's been a brilliant, bright light in the world, and I'm so excited that I was able to get this picture next to one of the Spanish black radish that she helped grow. The gentleman to her left is Dr. Daniel Strong. That is my father. And he grew up at the end of this road right here. This is our family farm in northern Wisconsin. And yes, he had to walk down this road uphill both ways in the wintertime to get to the one-room schoolhouse where his job as a student was to hand out goiter pills to the other students, because it was so known across the nation at this time that if they were not getting some form of iodine, the children would get goiters. And that's how obvious it was that this was a low area in iodine. So super important to know, because that farm is located way up here, right in northern Wisconsin, right in the dead heart of this goiter belt. And this gentleman over here is Dr. Derek Strong, who's an excellent educator and speaker as well. If you ever get an opportunity to learn from him, he teaches all over the country, so much knowledge that he has to share. So, but this is our origins. And I really wish I would have known back then that IQ is directly impacted by iodine. And in fact, I was speaking with one of my mentors last week, Mark Anderson, and he was sharing with me how one person was hypothesizing that if everybody on the planet had enough iodine, that the average IQ increase across the world, the whole world, would be 10 points higher. That's how important it is for this. Now, I've talked about this in other videos, but if you want to make sure you have maximum mental capacity, you probably want to make sure you're getting adequate iodine intake. And I wish I'd have known that growing up, because clearly I was at a disadvantage as a youth, even though I somehow managed to pass. And even going to school here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, somehow I was able to get through it all. Anyway, so just to give some ideas and some thoughts about what are some things that may give you a signal that the thyroid is part of what's going on. Not saying that, I never want to say that, there's just one part of the body that is driving everything, but we want to figure where the weakness might be specifically. And this is from Medical News Today. They talk about fatigue being one thing that could be definitely impacted by a thyroid not being fully functional. Weight gain could be a part of that. sore muscles and joints, mood and memory changes, feeling cold, constipation. I'm going to stop right there because I always stop right there when I have anybody I'm working with who has constipation, because we need to make sure things are moving along. If we have things coming into the body, we need the garbage going out. And so remember, if you're not having a bowel movement at least once a day, ideally twice a day, depending on how many meals you have or more, then you really need to focus on getting that moving first, because you have to have the digestive system working well if we're going to get anywhere with nutrition. So please pay attention. I have a whole constipation checklist that I'm more than happy to share with anybody and everybody. But there are foods and easy ways and things that you can kind of determine what might be the holdup when it comes to that. And I'm happy to get into that deeper at another time. High cholesterol. This is a lot of people forget this. They may be chasing it with medication, but they forget to check to see whether or not the thyroid is 100%. Slow heart rate could be it could be contributed by the thyroid. Hair loss, that's a big one. Dry skin, weak hair and nails, goiters, of course, and menstrual changes. All of that could be a part of this, could be due to the thyroid not getting everything that it needs. So, and of course, there are other late symptoms over here: decreased taste and smell, hoarseness, slow speech, thickening of the skin. The reason I'm reading all these is sometimes people just get stuck on a symptom and they're like, what's going on? Why do I have hoarseness? Well, I'm saying maybe you should just check in to see how your endocrine system's doing. Make sure your thyroid's working optimally, so that's not the issue. So when I talk about the thyroid, I just want to explain it in the simplest terms as I can. And I try to think of it as your body's backstage manager. So making sure everything's running smoothly from metabolism to mood. Once your thyroid releases something called T4. Now, it's been explained to me, actually, I believe it was Dr. Gaeta who first said this, that T4 is the inactive form. So that's kind of like Clark Kent, ready to go, but not necessarily in action at the moment. Into your bloodstream, certain cells in your body transform that into T3. That's Superman. That's the one that's making things happen. This is through a process called deiodination. So I point this out to remind us all of this amazing importance of iodine in this process, because T4, the 4 stands for 4 iodine molecules, and the 3 stands for 3 iodine molecules. So you really can't even make T4 yourself unless you have iodine. So it's an essential nutrient, has to come in from an external source for you to be able to make your own T4. Okay, so here's your thyroid gland. You got this feedback loop with the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Remember, it's never just one thing. All of these things are dancing together. They're all playing the music together at the same time. Now, I point this out because it seems like there is an absolute crazy amount of thyroid medication that's out there. And I think we need to ask better questions about this. Is why? Why has it been for so many years that there's so many people that need this synthetic T4? This piece that is just 4 parts iodine and 1 part something called tyrosine. And in fact, in 2022, it was still the #1 ranked out of the top 200 drugs, with 82,400,000 prescriptions filled and 18,130,000 total patients that were reported at Drug Stats and this resource down here. And so lisinopril, metformin, and atorvastatin were the only ones ahead of that. Now, what did we just talk about with cholesterol possibly being actually the result of thyroid medication? So it's interesting that both of those are at the top. And while I'm here, I just want to point out and remind people that look into the warnings on these as well. There is a black box warning as well for metformin. It's very important to know that. So always check to see what are the side effects. And I could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of these are things that we should be paying closer attention to the side effects on those. But I just give the scope in that. And here's what people have been saying, is that it's bioidentical. And I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate. Right? The thing about this is that the levothyroxine Synthroid is actually not identical after all. And in fact, our body does make something a little different. So just think about the fact that, why does it take your body to get used to this? Perhaps it's, your body's trying to figure out why it's not identical. And also, to give you a heads up, some research coming out that there are now some possibilities of a once weekly subcutaneous version of this coming out. meaning that kind of like the semaglutide applications, that they're just injecting themselves with it once a week as opposed to taking a daily medication. So let's just pause here and think about this for just a moment. And now I don't mean to cast aspersions on anybody or make anybody look bad or sound bad, but I want us to ask better questions and think critically. So what this is saying is that once a week, you're going to be giving yourself this T4 in an injection that is meant to last for the whole week. And I just asked this question: does the human body sit around all week not making T4 and then wait and just make all that your body needs for the whole week in one go and just blast it into your body and say, there you go for the week, I'm going to take the rest of the week off and I'm done? No, right? So there's something unnatural about that. And anytime something is unnatural, we want to start to question it and question it more, because your body has to respond to that. It has to be able to dance with that. It has to figure out how to make that fit into the music. And that does not fit into the music. So it may be something that they're getting some decent results with and everything, but understand that short term versus long term, very different how things happen in the body. We want to be in sync with nature because we are a part of nature. And I just want to remind you all that almost all medications are not something that are occurring in nature. That's how they're able to create them. They're looking for new molecules. They're looking for new things to affect the body. And so always know that, in my humble opinion, that if you are taking medication, it's because you're compensating for some chemistry in your own body to make things happen, and you're trying to force it to happen or make something happen with that medication. So if you're taking medication, keep asking questions. It shouldn't be the end of the conversation. Say, well, I'm taking medication, I'm fine. No, that's a signal that something might be missing. And clearly, I think I'm making the case here that it might be iodine that is often missing from that. Not only, but it might be the most likely suspect. There's some other ones that give you a combination of that T4 and the T3. A lot of times people are given these natural ones, which I do think, I do hear a lot of great feedback from people on those, especially if they've had a thyroidectomy, meaning that they've actually had their thyroid removed. In those cases, of course, you're compensating for the lack of the organ. So this is going to be a different story altogether. But if you have all of your organ cells and tissues, then you should be doing everything you can to help them to function optimally. And there's also something out with a combination of even something called T2, but I'm not going to get too deep into that right now. Now, there are some off-label uses of medication, and metformin is being used for Hashimoto's. There's 17 studies showing the impact on TSH and thyroid function. But this confuses me, and I just want to ask better questions about, well, how is that possible? Because when they cited what they were doing in this bioscientifica.com view, they were saying that it was a retrospective review of 4 patients with chronic hypothyroidism that suggested that metformin is involved in reducing TSH. 4 people in a retrospective study is probably not enough. Okay, so then there were some other things, and they looked in deeper, and there's a meta-analysis. But when we start to accept research, we always have to look at that research and understand how much weight are we going to give that. It's a beginning of a conversation. It's a suggestion that we start to have a conversation about it, but I would never hang my hat on any research and any education piece, including anything that I'm presenting to you. You want to think about it yourself deeply. But when I looked into all of these studies, yeah, there's another one that they looked at that was a 3-month prospective study with 8 people. Well, at least there is one here with 100 people in that. 27 people in this one, 33 in this one. So they're really cobbling together a lot of data on this. And so I just want to caution, and think about why is that happening and know a little bit more about that. I went a little too far here. And remind people that there is a boxed warning on that metformin as well. And at this point, I would invite anybody to do their own research and looking into something called berberine. Just do a simple Google search on berberine versus metformin, and maybe you have a different option out there if you're being guided by the right practitioner, that berberine might have a good place to help you with what you're trying to achieve. I'm not saying in respect to this, and I'm definitely not making any claims or suggestions. I'm just saying to look into it for yourself. Now, another one that was being used for thyroid is low-dose naltrexone. That's another off-label use for it. Now, there is a lack of scientific data to support this to date. It's only anecdotal. So again, whenever you're given a medication, it's wise to ask, well, what is the mechanism of action for this? Because we want to know, what is it actually trying to do in the body? It's amazing to me how many times it comes up and it says unknown. I think, no thanks, right? Why would I put something in my body that we don't even know what it's doing? Yikes. But anyway, in this one, naltrexone is a pure opioid receptor antagonist. So it primarily binds with the mu opioid receptors. By binding to the receptors, it blocks the euphoric, pleasurable, or high effects linked with alcohol or opioids. And it itself has little or no effect in the absence of alcohol or opioids. So why would that be being used for the thyroid? That just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. And it has a lot of side effects. Be mindful of that. Anytime you're taking a medication, you always have to look up the side effects. And this one in particular, anxiety, nervousness, restlessness, trouble sleeping. Man, almost everybody who comes into our clinic has some form of one of these. We don't want to add fuel to that fire. Headaches, that's another one. Joint or muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, unusual tiredness. Look, if this is common side effect, why aren't we looking at ways of just nourishing the thyroid instead of doing something that could potentially be doing this, plus all of these, including constipation, which is one of the issues that we were talking about earlier. And in fact, when you dig deep into this, there is no change in the consumption of thyroid hormones after starting this low-dose naltrexone. The conclusion of this study is that the results of the study do not support claims of efficacy of low-dose naltrexone in hypothyroidism. And so I'm not saying, that anybody out there who's done this before is wrong. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it really hasn't been supported in literature, and I'd be really hard pressed to understand what is the mechanism. I don't want to know that something's working. I want to know why it's working, because placebo is pretty powerful. And it can definitely impact the results in a lot of these things. If we don't know the why, then we have to be looking at whether that's placebo or not. And in the previous video, I did talk about when we look at levothyroxine in the physician's desk reference, the PDR, there are a lot of adverse reactions to that medication. And that is why I want us to be looking at whether or not have we fully nourished the thyroid first? Have we given the body what it needs to simply make its own T4? Have we ruled out an iodine deficiency before we jump into this? And unfortunately, I don't think that's happening. And I think that should be the first thing we're happening based on the literature and the research that I've showed with you so far. We should first be looking at whether or not there's iodine, because it's not just for the thyroid, it's for the whole body. And that's really important to remember, because these adverse reactions, according to the PDR, are pretty rugged. In fact, the top one here is heart failure. That is the number one reason that people do not achieve longevity. That's why we focus on the heart. Why would we be giving something that could be causing heart failure when it might just be an iodine deficiency, or cardiac arrest, or arrhythmia, or seizures, right? And these are just the severe ones. There's also moderate ones, infertility, hypertension, a bunch of other things that you may start taking other medications for. And there's even mild ones like alopecia, all of this that could be the result of that medication, or it could be the result of, instead of identifying the nutritional deficiency, you took the medication, and that deficiency is going to show itself in another form in the body, because we have to have these nutrients. They are essential. And if we're not supplying our body with these essential nutrients, we are going to have some kind of symptomatic expression somewhere along the line that says, you aren't giving me enough to take care of this. Now, I do want to remind everybody that T in T4 is from protein. It's tyrosine. It's a conditionally essential amino acid. So oftentimes, you may not have enough T to go around to make T4, because that tyrosine is also needed to make all kinds of other things in the body. Most notably, when I talk about this, dopamine, that neurotransmitter that you want. And so if we were looking at triage theory, and there's not enough tyrosine to go around to make enough T4 and enough dopamine and all the other things we need for it, is it possible that your T4 is low because you just don't have enough tyrosine? Well, when you look at people's protein intake and you look at how quickly they're eating and they're not digesting their food, then you start to think, well, maybe we should focus on making sure that they have enough protein, they're digesting the protein, so we have enough T to make T4 as well. Just a different way of thinking about this to satisfy what we're really trying to do to heal the body. Now, there are also contraindications when in that PDR. There is a boxed warning on it, but these are pretty serious, right? Acute myocardial infarction, uncorrected adrenal insufficiency. And this is the one I'm focusing on here specifically because, again, I asked, before that medication was prescribed, did they rule out uncorrected adrenal insufficiency? Was there some measure taken to rule that out? Because it is actually contraindicated. And when you look at our lifestyle, when you look at the way the Americans live, and I've said this a few times before, these adrenal glands are very small. They're this big, but we live our lives like they're this big. We're leaning on them all the time. We're trying to stimulate them with coffee. We're trying to push through and muscle through. We're not giving them enough time to recover during the day. We're not letting them recover at night. And we just want to go, 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 go. So are we putting ourselves at risk of adrenal insufficiency? And is it likely that that is a true part of this symphony that's the problem? Maybe the thyroid is actually on the right key, but it's the adrenal section of the orchestra that's playing a little flat because they're tired and they're overworked and they're doing way more than what they were intended to be doing. And that's driving the entire symphony a little flat. Just a question to think about and consider for yourself in the future. And there's a lot you can do to help those poor little guys along. Okay, so that was part one. Now we're going to dive into part two here and the anatomy of it. Again, this T, as I just said, stands for tyrosine. That is a conditionally essential amino acid. And the 4 stands for how many iodine molecules are attached to it, and the 3, how many iodine are attached to that. So we have the relatively inactive T4 getting converted into T3. The thyroid gland produces 20% of the highly active T3 and 80% of the T4. Okay, so now we understand we need to have a lot of tyrosine and protein. We got to be able to digest that protein and get those amino acids out. And we have to have adequate iodine before we can make our own T4. Okay, now there's a few other things that could, slow down this process. You may not have absorption or transport of the dietary iodine. And sometimes when you have way, 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 way excess amounts of brassica or cassava or things like these people talking about being goitrogenic. Typically, you have to be a really high amount of those before it really gets into it. But if you're examining the diet and looking at somebody and they're only eating just tons of those vegetables, that could be blocking the absorption of the iodine as well. Now, if there's somebody out there watching who has greater knowledge about that or disagreement or can share something of value in that, please do. I'm not saying that this is 100%. I'm saying in my experience, I don't think that it's helpful to tell people not to eat a good, healthy vegetable. It's just important to eat it in the appropriate amounts. Too much of anything can be a bad thing. Too much kale can be a bad thing. So just remember that. But I put this up here to specifically bring out the importance of selenium. Selenium is another one of those micronutrients that is missing quite a bit in the soil and from the American diet. It's estimated that 1 billion people on the planet are deficient in selenium. So now if we got 2 billion that we know aren't getting enough iodine, plus it might be being washed out by fluoride, chlorine, bromine, and we got another billion that are missing selenium, why aren't we ruling out those things first before we're starting to put in a synthetic T4? It's quite likely that we're missing those and we need to rule that out first. Okay, so there are other nutrients that I want to point out that are also going to be important for the body. Many other vitamins and nutrients influence thyroid function, most notably vitamin A, very common. People aren't getting enough of that. What if we're giving thyroid medication, but it was actually just a vitamin A deficiency that was causing what seemed to be a thyroid problem? What if it was an iron deficiency? What if it was a zinc deficiency? A 2019 review found that patients with hypothyroidism had lower levels of zinc compared to healthy controls. So consider supplementing with them in hypothyroidism, especially if deficiency states are suspected. This is from this research study right down here below. This is not me saying that. I'm just sharing with you the research. And the reason I point these out is because they're very common. And we do want to be constantly using medication as a means to feed back to us and say, wait a minute, am I needing this just because I'm missing specific nutrients that would help me be able to do this on my own? And it's not just iodine, not just selenium. It's also possibly vitamin A, iron, and zinc. And these are likely low. In fact, iron is the most common deficiency in the world. And zinc is something I'm seeing all the time. So it's worth also saying, where am I getting these in my diet as well? Or where is this individual getting these in their diet? That doesn't only include those. Of course, vitamin D is another one that's very commonly missing. Copper, magnesium, B12, all of these are essential for complete thyroid function. And microbiome, okay? There's a lot of opportunities to help heal people's microbiomes. So again, all these individuals that are out there maybe struggling with thyroid, you have multiple opportunities to determine, are you missing a piece in one of these other places, and how can we bring balance for them? And beyond that, the cells in the following tissues, glands, and organs in the body system can do the conversion of that inactive to the active form, primarily the liver and the kidneys. So if you're getting a lab back and you have really high T4 but really low T3, maybe the conversation with your doctor should be about liver. How's my liver doing? Is it working, functionally 100%? Is it getting everything it needs? What about my kidneys? These are very commonly being challenged by all of the different toxins we're being exposed to on a daily basis. There are other areas in the body that it's also being converted, but these are the first two that I would be thinking about the most. Now, T3 and T4 affect every cell and all the organs in your body by, number one, regulating the rate at which your body uses calories, so that's energy, and this affects your weight loss or weight gain and is also called the metabolic rate. There's a slowing down or speeding up of your heart rate that is going to be affected by these, raising or lowering of your body temperature. So if you're somebody who's commonly not feeling the same temperature in the room as other people, if you're always cold when people are warm or always hot when people are cold, maybe, this could be a part of what's going on with your thyroid. Influencing the speed at which food moves through your digestive tract. That's interesting to note because gastroparesis is something that is also part of the same reaction to these medications that are potentially causing thyroid cancer. So there might be a connection there for you to investigate. Brain development. Now, I'm going to stop right there. The World Health Organization lists iodine deficiency as the #1 preventable cause of mental retardation in the world. So again, I want to remind you of the importance of iodine, not just for your thyroid, but also for your brain. Very important for your brain. Okay. It's also involving controlling the way your muscles contract, managing skin and bone maintenance by controlling the rate at which your body replaces cells. So the normal process. Now, I often talk about the fact that our bodies replace on average somewhere around 330 billion cells every day. And that's plus or minus 20 billion, I think. But of course, that's going to be plus or minus depending on the function of your thyroid. Like, is it being able to function appropriately? So here are some of the tests that I think would give a greater picture if you are wanting to take control of your health and to talk to your doctor about. Because one of the things that makes me confused is that for years, this thyroid stimulating hormone was the only lab that would be run before somebody's giving a synthetic T4. So my question is always, well, why, if you're giving somebody a T4, if you're giving them a total T4, why aren't you first checking how much T4 is actually in the human body first? I really think that makes more sense. It seems to have a logical reasoning. And so I think all of you can ask that question yourselves and figure out what answers you get for that. So I would want to know about mine, in which I did, and I'm going to share my labs in a second. What is my total T4? What is my free T4? What is the total T3? Is this converting into that? And what's the free T3? And then what is that thyroid stimulating hormone? What's going on there? And I'm going to share some very interesting information about that in just a little bit. And also, it would be nice to check and see if there's any antibodies, right? Are there thyroid antibodies? Also, thyroglobulin. This is the test that's used to diagnose thyroiditis, inflamed thyroid, and to monitor the treatment of thyroid cancer. So if you're going to do the lab, you might as well get all the information to get a full picture. Now, these ranges that I'm going to show on here are not something that I'm going to say everybody should follow to a T. This is not what I'm telling you. I'm saying for me, these are the ranges that I believe I would like to find myself in just over years of looking at this and in consideration and talking to many different healthcare practitioners who work in the functional space. I'm not saying that if you're outside of this, that it's diagnosed as anything. I'm just saying that this is kind of where I think is a good target for me to look at. And so for the total T4, usually, if you're below 7.5, that's when I want to start looking for myself as whether or not I'm getting enough iodine. Or maybe somebody's getting exposed to excess androgens, meaning testosterone, from an exogenous source, meaning are they taking testosterone replacement therapy? That could be one of the contributing factors to driving that low. Another thing, if it's higher than 8.1 in the T4, it might be exposure to exogenous estrogen. We have tons of people being given exogenous estrogen, whole other topic of conversation, but just know that it could also be impacting your thyroid in a way that may make things confusing. And of course, thyroid medications might drive this too high, and hyperthyroidism might also be a piece of that. We're talking about the free T4. So this is the unbound form, and it's readily available for use in the tissues. Remember, we have two different forms. We got the total. So this is the main hormone excreted by the gland. Serum access is both bound, 95%, and unbound, 5% components. And it's shuttled to the cells via this thyroid binding globulin, TBG, and albumin. Now, this enzyme here, I'm going to get into a little bit, transforms the T4 into T3, and it depends on many cofactors: selenium, magnesium, zinc, and iodine. Okay, but the free form, the unbound form, is rarely used for the tissue. And this is a tighter range, typically, what I would want to know. If it's below 1, again, I'm looking at maybe there's not enough iodine that's being given. Again, it could be those testosterone exogenous ones, could be estrogen dominance, interestingly enough, that could be doing that. But then you also want to look at that pituitary gland. Is your pituitary been getting enough love lately? If it's above 1.5, sometimes I look at insulin sensitivity. Again, I want to take this information and look at things globally in the body. And so these are just some thoughts on that. And I'm just going to leave these up for a minute for you guys to noodle on in your own time. And then the total T3 is the active form of this. And if it's below 90, then again, I'm looking at an inadequacy, but this time it's selenium levels that I'm looking at. Because remember, we just talked about, to convert that T4 into T3, we need selenium. If it's really low and it's not converting, potentially selenium is the #1 thing I want to look at. Now, if it's really high, it might not be enough iodine, actually, or it's that low stomach acid or poor protein digestion, which is so common. And in fact, I would rule this out before anything else in almost any case, because so many people are not digesting proteins. And remember, to replace anything in the body, whether it's a hormone, the thyroid hormone, whether it is an enzyme to do that conversion, all of those have to have amino acids to make those. And these are essential amino acids. So we have to bring them in from an exogenous source. We have to eat the protein to get them. So many things could not be functioning just because you don't have enough of the amino acids to build the enzymes or the proteins themselves. Okay, and the free T range, again, a little bit tighter. I'd like to see it closer to 3. It could be a sign of how effectively T4 is converting, of course. And again, selenium if it's low, iodine if it's high, just things to think about. Now, again, this is not diagnostic. This is for you to start looking at to see, is that part of it? And again, low stomach acid, same thing here. Now, there's another one that I didn't put on the list before, and it's called reverse T3. Now, this serves as a receptor regulator, filling in the receptor sites. So I think of this as kind of the body hitting the brakes a little bit if things are going too fast, to slow things down. And if this is really low, then we want to look deeper into this hypothyroidism situation, what's going on with the thyroid itself. But if it's high, that could be a sign of your liver not functioning 100%. It could be, again, a selenium deficiency. It could just be stress that's causing that. It could, again, be a pituitary thing. So there's a lot of reasons why that might be high, but take a look at that too, because that can help give you some great information. Now, the TSH, the final guy, the one that for a long time, a lot of people have only looked at this before just saying that somebody had a bad thyroid or low thyroid function. And when this is low, I actually want to start looking at a possibility of a heavy metal toxicity. This is a lot more common than we realize. We were exposed to so many toxic metals. When you're driving down the street, exhaust from the cars, you're breathing in things that have heavy metals in them. So much of our produce has actually been saturated with it. I remind people, if it's not on the clean 15, if it's on the dirty dozen, there's a likelihood that there is some contamination of heavy metals. Apples specifically and rice can be really high in arsenic. And it's known that a lot of the chocolates out there, unfortunately, are actually really high in cadmium and lead. So you really got to be careful with your sourcing on that. And I do a whole different video that goes over those chocolates, and you can look up consumer reports yourself to know those. But if you want me to give you, just link me below, I'll give you some more information on that. But know that these heavy metals can really cause a lot of confusion in the body, and we should be aware of the possibility of that being the problem. Now, if it's higher than 2, it is very likely that there's a selenium deficiency going on here. And again, you want to look into the selenium intake, the selenium in that if you're in an area that's selenium low. And if you look at the maps, and I do a whole video on this specifically, the Pacific Northwest is low in selenium in the soil, and the entire East Coast. So if you live in either of those areas, I'd be very much looking keenly at your selenium intake. Now, fish are going to be one of the best ways to get it from the ocean. Of course, people talk about Brazil nuts, but I can talk more deeply about that. You want to make sure those are organic when you're getting, if you're using those. And of course, you don't want to do too much of those because there can be toxicity with that as well. But again, if that TSH is high, there's also possibility of a congested liver. We've tons of people eating lots of sugar, lots of alcohol consumption in America. So this is possibility of a likely suspect, or it could be some pituitary dysfunction, or even a gluten sensitivity is very likely in those situations. So this is all very good information to take into consideration instead of just saying, oh, well, I'm just going to take a medication because the TSH is high. Well, if you do that, okay, I mean, that's your choice, and I support you in whatever decisions you make. I just want to show you that you also might want to look at your selenium levels. You might want to take care of your liver, and you might also want to maybe look at that gluten sensitivity situation, which is a very long story, but just be cautious of it for a while, I would say, or pay attention to it anyway. So here's my labs, right? So I went to Function Health. Function Health is this great thing that Dr. Mark Hyman has put out, and it's really helpful because you get so many labs for a relatively inexpensive. I mean, compared to what it used to be to pay for all these, it's just around $500, and you get hundreds of them, and then you get to redo them. Wonderful option that's out there right now. And you're probably going to see a lot more of this happening. But when I got mine back, this thyroid stimulating hormone was pretty high. We just talked about it being above a 2, being something to pay attention to. So you better believe I'm looking at, did I eat a lot of gluten? How's my liver doing? Am I getting enough selenium? I'm looking at all those things. Well, at least my thyroid globulin antibodies were fine. My other antibodies were fine, and my T4 and T3 seem to be fine. So this is that range. They want it up to 4.5. I like it actually lower personally. So I'm going, whoa, all right. Most people be like, Dustin, what's going on, man? You thyroid, dude, we need to get you a new one, or we need to get you on levothyroxine stat. Okay, but let's just think about that. If this was somebody if they're just going off this number and they're saying, okay, we need to give you levothyroxine, which is synthetic T4. Remember that. Well, let's look at my T4 first. Wait a minute. My T4 is in range. It's at 1.2. So wait a minute. Explain to me, if it's in the healthy range, how is putting more in there going to correct this problem? Now, somebody may have a smart answer for that, but it's a question I think that is worth asking. How is putting more into an equation where it's already enough good enough? And I repeat, it's in range. I'm going to go into those a little bit deeper in a minute. Now, well, maybe it's that the T4 isn't converting into T3, and so that's what's feeding back to the hypothalamus and pituitary to say, hey, increase the thyroid stimulating hormone. But wait a minute, my T3 is also in range. In fact, I reiterate, that's also in range. Okay, well, hold on now. This is getting a little more interesting, isn't it? Now, the thing about this labs, now, no matter what, always have someone to discuss this with who has some experience with this, because the information that they're giving in there is very generalized and not entirely accurate always in their summaries. Because as I'll read to you, what it tells me in my summary is that my TSH levels mean that my thyroid gland is underactive and producing too little thyroid hormone. It means that I'm producing too little thyroid hormone, except that my thyroid hormones are in range. So how is it possible? How do you mean that it's too little thyroid hormone if it's in range? Something isn't adding up here. So please don't just accept these summaries as absolute truth. What is the deal? Now, often for years, I've carried stacks of a very important book that I like people to read, and it's called Iodine: Why You Need It and Why You Can't Live Without It. Dr. David Brownstein did tons of research on this, and he even answers this question: why does TSH increase when starting iodine therapy? Well, now we're on to something. Before you take these labs, they say stop taking supplements and don't eat fish for a few days before this. Now, I had this done on, I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday morning, and I had dinner with my mother the night before doing this, and she served fish. And I'm not going to disrespect my mom just because I'm going to get a lab. I ate the fish. So I got a good source of iodine, which I probably shouldn't have done before going in, because as he states on page 83 of this book, which I encourage everybody to read, TSH has another function besides stimulating the thyroid hormone production. It also helps stimulate the body's production of the iodine transport molecules. I dumped a bunch of iodine in my body, and I needed iodine transport molecules. The sodium iodide transporter, NIS, sodium iodide transporter, or symporter. Without adequate amounts of this sodium iodine symporter, iodine would not be able to enter the cells and be utilized. So what was my body doing? It was trying to utilize the iodine that I dumped in there. Now, is that 100%? Maybe, maybe not. But we should all know that if you had anything, if you ate strawberries from a coast before going in to have your thyroid checked, your TSH could have been elevated because of the iodine transport symporter. You could have had eggs that were from a chicken on the coast. You could have had lox and bagels the day before. You could have had some salmon for dinner the night before. And so that TSH could be elevated just because you ate foods containing iodine. Really important. Now, I may be low in selenium, and I've included some extra selenium into my life because of that. And I've, been careful of my gluten and been taking better care of my liver, all of those things. But this is super important for everybody to know. Okay, so again, when I've got my T4 in the middle of the range and my T3 in the middle of the range, it's hard for me to accept this premise that my TSH being elevated means that these are not adequate, because clearly they are. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about selenium and TSH as well. This study showed that selenium supplementation was associated with slightly lower serum TSH than in the controls in participants not using thyroid hormone. And one study showed that the strongest effects of selenium supplementation used 200 of these units per day of selenium for 6 months. All right, I say that to tell you that minerals take time to balance in the body. This isn't something that you can go, oh, I'm low in selenium, take 200 units, and then the next day you're fine. No, your body needs time to balance these minerals out, and they have to come in a balanced form. It could take you 3, 4, 5, and according to this, 6 months before they get there. So just remember that nature has its own pace, and nature has its own timetable, and we're a part of nature, so we have to be respectful of that. We can't just immediately correct a deficiency in one day or a week or 1 month. Sometimes it takes 6 months to truly get it right. Okay. Now, what I do like about these Function Health at functionhealth.com is it does show you foods that they suggest to eat. Now, it does say wild or sustainably raised cold water fish. I disagree with that part. I want it to be wild. Sustainably raised could mean that it was farm raised, and I just don't have the same confidence in those that it's actually going to deliver the nutrient content that we need, that nature would provide from a wild caught salmon, herring, mackerel, halibut, or sardines. I'm so happy the sardines made it on that list. But what's cool is that what they're focusing on here is food as medicine, and making sure that you're getting the nourishment from good foods so that your body can do what it's designed to do by eating the foods and putting things where they're supposed to be. So they talk about some cooked greens like broccoli, spinach, and dark leafy greens, carrots, sweet potatoes. These are all excellent sources of a lot of different things I encourage people to include. Lots of nuts and seeds, some of my favorites on there, which I eat almost every day. And then some whole gluten-free grains. Gluten-free, remember we talked about that earlier. And some sea vegetables. I love that they're talking about that as well. Things like molasses that are actually a great source of a lot of nutrients, but even brassicas, okay? So we talked about this earlier, being worried about that. Broccoli, collards, mustard greens, and kale, in appropriate amounts, you still need some of them. I would not tell somebody, absolutely stay away from those like your life depended on it. No, you still need those. Now, it also talks about foods to limit for this. Eliminate anything that is not natural food. Well, I think that's fantastic advice for any health condition, like junk items, artificial sweeteners, processed foods in a box, package or can, and anything with ingredients you don't recognize or can't pronounce. I could have had this tattooed on my forehead for the last 30 years, and it probably still would bear repeating to every person I meet. Right there, eliminate these bad things if you truly want to be healthy. Also seek out your sensitivities and eliminate them to potentially resolve your issue. That's definitely something we do here when we have our new clients. We do an IgG food sensitivity to identify those things that are specifically aggravating that person, to help them avoid them for a little while and understand what else you can do so you're not pouring fuel on the fire all the time. But some of the most likely ones here are white flour, white rice, pasta. Okay, remember we talked about how even in breads and things, they're now using bromine to bake them, and that bromine will compete with the iodine. So remember that. And there's also in things that are inorganic, like the white rice, high risk of things like arsenic. So careful of the white refined sugars, high fructose corn syrup, of course, and refined oils like canola, corn oil, soybean. All of these I would agree with. Definitely no margarine. That's completely unnatural. It's a Franken food. They actually add a molecule to it to be able to make it dead nor alive, which is interesting. And then they talk about big carnivore fish because this is where you get bioaccumulation of heavy metals like mercury. So there's another thing to consider. We want to be careful of those. Gluten products, careful with your coffee, your alcohol, your sodas, goitrogens like soybeans, peanuts, pine nuts, millet. Just be aware, there's some great resources that they give you on there and why it matters. And it also talks about these medications that may interfere with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about these, but prednisone I don't mention later, so pay attention to that. Some of these might interfere with what's going on in the body. And two things to note. Although Brazil nuts, I mentioned those earlier, are great for the thyroid due to their high selenium content, it's also important to only eat small amounts at a time because if they're inorganic especially, they can contain some arsenic. And we talked about apples and rice being an arsenic issue, so we want to be careful of our arsenic intake, which can build up if eaten in excess over a long period of time. And also goitrogens, so be careful of that piece right there and just read up on that. It's very helpful information. So the goitrogens, as I mentioned, are substances found in root vegetables like cabbages, brassicas, and they can interfere with the utilization of iodine by the thyroid gland and can impact the thyroid function. However, cooking those vegetables reduces the presence of the goitrogens, so make sure to eat them cooked rather than raw. All right, so let's talk about a couple of medications that may be something somebody's taking, and that could be why the thyroid is looking goofy or not exactly as it's supposed to. And most people don't realize that even beta blockers, a very common blood pressure medication, may be impacting the thyroid. It says here they don't appear to alter the synthesis or secretion of the thyroid hormone by the thyroid gland. Their effects on it are contradictory. Decreased thyroxine to T3, so T4 to T3 conversion, is caused by some, but not all, beta blockers. And this appears to correlate with the membrane stabilizing activity. So the reason I point this out is it's not all the time, but it may be contributing to a low T3, high T4 situation. So it's worth knowing that that might be part of what's going on there. Let's take a look at another medication that could be contributing to some of the things. NSAIDs. Now, I recently shared a whole video about how from the very first dose of these, you actually start to increase risk of a lot of things. So always look for other options. In that video, I talk about if it's a headache that you're trying to get rid of, I understand you want to get rid of the pain right away, but still learn from the headache. Use that as information. It's almost like a crystal ball as to what's going amok in your body that's causing this pain in your head. There's always something in your body that's driving the head pain. Almost always we can learn from it and have a much better utilization. But also know, this is something that people are commonly taking. They don't think about it. They don't even tell you about it when they're coming in. And so the clinician should be aware of these medications because they can displace thyroid hormones from the thyroid binding globulin and elevate free T4 and free T3 concentrations and depress thyrotropin levels. So multiple things that this could be impacting when it comes to looking at the thyroid. Another medication that we want to be aware of is SSRI. So these are the most widely used antidepressants worldwide. And it's really important to note that they have been shown to have adverse effects on the endocrine system. And that's what we've been talking about today. That whole symphony, right? From the hypothalamus all the way through, the whole symphony can be impacted by these. So very important to take note of that. Emphasized by a dysregulation in glucose metabolism, which is a huge concern in the United States, sexual dysfunction and fertility, all affected by those. This alarming topic necessitates particular consideration, as the awareness of these effects could aid physicians in selecting the most appropriate treatment plan, and more notably, in monitoring the clinical progress of the patients during this treatment, in particular, the emphasis on the endocrine system. So another thing to pay attention to. Okay. And also, lithium carbonate is going to be one of the last ones that we want to be aware of. Now, really quickly here, I just want to point out that this is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medications, but it's the carbonate form. And oftentimes when people are being given these, they're given them in very large amounts, 300 milligrams up to 1,800 milligrams. And I did mention this in the previous video, so just be aware of that as well. And obviously the conclusions overall is that the accurate interpretation of these can be complicated by these medications. So be aware of those medications. I already talked about the PDR and some things that we can talk about. I'm gonna end it here for you for now. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for sticking in there with me. Hopefully this is going to get you on the right step forward and helping you understand what the next right thing is to do. So we'll get you on the next step, and I'll continue to give the rest of this series as I have time to record these to share with all of you. Have a great day.